last time I spoke, we looked at lessons from the life of Abraham, and we saw how he followed God, and we learnt the lesson that for Abraham, being righteous was more important than simply being right. And today we're going to look at these same stories in the life of Abraham, but instead of looking at how Abraham followed, we're going to look at how God chose to lead him. And from the title you can see there, you can all guess that God chose to lead Abraham by his promise. Now, the story of Abraham starts in Genesis 12. We start here in Genesis 12, verse 1. Now the Lord had said unto Abram, get thee out of thy country, and from thy kindred, and from thy father's house, unto a land that I will show thee. And I will make of thee a great nation, and will bless thee, and make thy name great, and thou shalt be a blessing. And I will bless them that bless thee, and curse him that curseth thee. And in thee shall all families of the earth be blessed. So this is God's calling to Abraham. When he calls Abraham to follow him, he calls him with this promise. I want you to notice there's two words that God repeats in there 4 times. It's the words, I will. God says to Abraham, come into the land that I will show you, and I will make you great, and I will bless you, and I will bless them that bless thee. Okay. God's calling to Abraham is a constant reinforcing of the promise of what God will do. And with this calling, we're going to look at this later, where this appears again. God's calling to Abraham is a promise of what he will do. 4 times he says, I will. I want us to notice that the last thing that he says he will do, in that very last line, he says that in thee shall all families of the earth be blessed. Now, this line is picked up in the New Testament, and we're going to turn there to the book of Galatians. And we're going to see how Paul expands on this, how what he's saying is, what is the calling that God is giving to Abraham here? In Galatians chapter 3 and verse 8, we read, and the scripture foreseeing that God would justify the heathen through faith, preached before the gospel unto Abraham, saying, in thee shall all nations be blessed. So here, when God was speaking to Abraham, when he was giving him that promise, Paul is looking back on that in Galatians and saying, God was preaching the gospel to Abraham. It wasn't a prophet preaching, it wasn't the apostles preaching. When God himself chose to preach the gospel, he gave the promise of what he would do. So when he's calling Abraham, he's calling him with the gospel promise. And we're going to carry on looking at this in Jeremiah 31, when we first read about the new covenant promise that God will give to his people, what he would make with his children. We find this in Jeremiah 31, starting in verse 33. He says, but this is the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel after those days, saith the Lord. I will put my laws in their inward parts and write it in their hearts, and will be their God, and they shall be my people. And they shall teach no more every man his neighbor and every man his brother, saying, know the Lord. For they shall all know me, from the least of them unto the greatest of them, saith the Lord. For I will forgive their iniquities, and I will remember their sins no more. And so here in this gospel promise, the promise of the new covenant, we see it's the same type of language God uses. It's the same type of promise that God gave to Abraham. It's all about what he will do. 4 times here, God says, I will. Just like we read in Genesis 12, 4 times God spoke to Abraham saying, I will. So God called Abraham with this gospel promise. He preached the gospel to Abraham, calling him to follow him with following the promise of what God will do. Now, the one more point I want to look at that brings significance to this calling of Abraham is, yes, God called him with the gospel promise, but where was Abraham when God called him? Where did he call him from? Now, we read God's calling to Abraham in Genesis chapter 12. If we turn back a chapter into 11, we read this story of the people after the flood gathered together. And in Genesis 11, verse 4, and they said, go to, let us build a city and a tower whose top may reach unto heaven, and let us make us a name, lest we be scattered abroad upon the face of the whole earth. This is the story. They built the Tower of Babel. And we carry on in verse 8. So the Lord scattered them abroad from thence upon the face of all the earth, and they left off to build the city. Therefore is the name of it called Babel, because the Lord did confound the languages of all the earth. And from thence did the Lord scatter them abroad upon the face of all the earth. So we have Abraham's calling in chapter 12. And right before that, we have the story of the Tower of Babel, where God did confound the languages. He confused the languages and scattered the people. And this is where God called Abraham from. Now, an interesting point to note is it uses the word Babel here in Genesis 11. But in the original Hebrew, that is the same word as used throughout Scripture, speaking of Babylon. Every other time this word appears, it's translated as Babylon. Now, I don't know why our English versions translate them differently, but it is the exact same word. So this is actually the founding of the city of Babylon that is being described here in Genesis 11. And this is where God calls Abraham out of. God gives Abraham, he preaches to him the gospel of promise to call him out of Babylon. And so this gives us a bit more significance to this gospel calling. Okay, Abraham was living in Babylon. If you carry on reading in chapter 11, it gives us a bit of a genealogy, and it talks about Abraham being in Ur of the Chaldees. Now, the Chaldeans were the people of Babylon. We see that elsewhere in Scripture as well. So Abraham is living in Babylon when God gives him the gospel to call him out of it. I find that interesting. He didn't need to leave Babylon first, and then God delivers to him the promise of the gospel. He was living in Babylon, and God called him with the gospel promise from Babylon. God used the gospel to call his people out of Babylon. And so God called Abraham with the gospel of promise. He calls him out of Babylon. He calls him with the promise of what he will do. And he calls him with the preaching of the gospel. So God called Abraham with the promise. And after he received this calling, in Genesis 12, verses 1 to 3, in verse 4, we read, So Abraham departed as the Lord had spoken unto him, and Lot went with him. And Abraham was 75 years old when he departed out of Haran. And so immediately when Abraham receives this gospel of promise, he follows. And in response to him following, in verse 7, we read, And the Lord appeared unto Abraham and said, Unto thy seed will I give this land. And there he built an altar unto the Lord who appeared unto him. So God gives Abraham this promise to call him out of Babylon. And Abraham is faithful. He trusts in the promise, and he follows God. And as soon as he follows, God again comes to him and confirms the promise. He gives him the promise again. He is continuing to lead him with this promise. We see this in chapter 12. And if we turn to the next chapter, chapter 13, we're going to see this again. In chapter 13, we have the story of there is a strife between the herdsmen of Abraham's cattle and the herdsmen of Lot's. The land isn't big enough to support them both. There's not enough resources there. And so we pick up this story in verse 7. And there was strife between the herdsmen of Abram's cattle and the herdsmen of Lot's cattle. And the Canaanites and the Perizzites dwelt then in the land. And Abraham said unto Lot, Let there be no strife, I pray thee, between me and thee, and between my herdsmen and thy herdsmen, for we be brethren. Is not the whole land before thee? Separate thyself, I pray thee, from me. If thou wilt take the left hand, then I will go to the right. Or if thou depart to the right hand, then I will go to the left. And we looked at this in a bit more depth last time when this strife happened. Abraham was concerned about the fighting that was going to break out between the people of God. But he remembered God's promise. God had brought him into this land so that through him he could be a blessing to all nations, that God wanted. That's one of the 4 I wills, that I will bless thee, and in thee shall all families of the earth be blessed. And as we read through this and we see the strife coming up, you notice there, it drops in that line, and the Canaanite and the Perizzite dwelt then in the land. That tells us what Abraham was concerned about. Abraham was concerned that The people that God had called Abraham to witness in front of, that God could be a blessing to them through him, they were seeing this and they were going to lose face. God was going to be dishonored before them. Whereas Abraham didn't want this. Abraham was willing to suffer loss so that God could be honored before the people, so that they would not have a bad witness. Abraham knew what God had promised him, and Abraham trusted in the promise, so he was willing to suffer loss. And as a result, in verse 14, God appears to Abraham again. It says, "And the Lord said unto Abraham after that Lot was separated from him, Lift up now thine eyes, and look from the place where thou art, northward and southward, eastward and westward. For all the land which thou seest, to thee will I give it, and to thy seed forever. And I will make thy seed as the dust of the earth, so that if a man can number the dust of the earth, then shall thy seed also be numbered. Arise, walk through the land, in the length of it and in the breadth of it, for I will give it unto thee." And here again we see Abraham is brought into this test where there is going to be a schism between God's people. There is fighting and argument between God's people in front of all the people of the land. And Abraham is faithful to God. Abraham puts God's honor and glory before his own possessions, before his own earthly gains. And God again comes to him and gives him the promise. So in chapter 12, we saw that Abraham was trusted in the promise and he followed it. And God came to him and confirmed him with the promise. Here in chapter 13, Abraham is again faithful to God and God confirms it by giving him the promise again. And in chapter 14, the next chapter, we see the same thing. Here we have the story of the battle of the kings. And we jump into the story in verse 10. "And the vale of Siddim was full of slime pits, and the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah fled and fell there. And they that remained fled to the mountains. And they took all the goods of Sodom and Gomorrah and all their victuals and went their way. And they took Lot, Abram's brother's son, who dwelt in Sodom, and his goods, and departed. And after this, one of the men from the battle came and told Abram what had happened, and he gathered together all his men and armed them and went and set up an ambush and defeated these invading kings and saved Lot and all the people that were with him and all their goods and brought them back. And as they're coming back, the king of Sodom comes out to meet them. And we pick this story up again in verse 21. And the king of Sodom said unto Abram, Give me the persons and take the goods to thyself. And Abraham said to the king of Sodom, I have lifted up mine hand unto the Lord, the Most High God, the possessor of heaven and earth, that I will not take from thee even to a shoe latch, and that I will not take anything that is thine, lest thou shouldest say, I have made Abraham rich. And again, God called Abraham with that promise, saying, I will bless thee and I will make thee rich. And here, when Abraham is returning from the battle with all the riches, and the king says, look, you can keep the riches to yourself, Abraham says, no, I have lifted up my hand to God. I have trusted his promise. If I get wealth in this land, if I increase in goods, I want you to know it is because of God's promise, not because you have given me your riches. So again, Abraham trusted in the promise of God. And as a result, God appears to him in chapter 15. We read in verse 1. After these things, the word of the Lord came to Abraham in a vision, saying, Fear not, Abram, I am thy shield and thy exceeding great reward. And then if we jump down to verse 5, we read, And he brought him forth abroad and said, Look now towards heaven and tell the stars if thou be able to number them. And he said unto him, So shall thy seed be. And Abraham believed in the Lord, and he counted it to him for righteousness. And so here we've seen in these three stories. In Genesis 12, Abraham is faithful to the promise and he follows God. And God again confirms the promise to him. In chapter 13, Abraham is faithful and he trusts in God and he gives Lot the best land. And God again comes to him and confirms the promise. In chapter 14, Abraham gives all the wealth back because he doesn't want God to be dishonored. He wants God to be glorified because he trusts the promise. And God again gives him the promise. Every time Abraham steps forward in faith, God continues to lead him by constantly keeping the promise before him. And here we have this First, Abraham believed God and it was counted to him for righteousness in chapter 15. And going on from here, God then confirms this promise with a covenant to Abraham in verse 9. And he said unto him, take me a heifer of 3 years old, and a she-goat of 3 years old, and a ram of 3 years old, and a turtle dove, and a young pigeon. And he took unto him all these, and divided them in the midst, and laid each piece one against another, but the birds he divided not. Now, this imagery here of what Abraham's doing isn't immediately relevant to us, because it's got very much cultural significance to them in that day. This is how people would make a covenant. They would take the animals, they would cut them into and separate them on each side. It's the idea of cutting a covenant. And the two parties making the covenant would then walk together through the animals that had been sacrificed, would walk through that path that they have made as a symbol that they have made this covenant together. They have cut the covenant and they are walking through it together. That they in this together, they will be together. Both of them have responsibilities to make sure that this covenant is fulfilled, whatever the deal was that has been made. And so God is given the promise to Abraham, the same gospel promise that he gave in chapter 12, he is now confirming with a covenant. And so Abraham has set the pieces up and he is waiting for God to show up so he can walk through this covenant with God, so they can be in this together. But as we carry on reading in verse 11, and when the fowls came down upon the carcass, Abraham drove them away. And when the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell upon Abram. And lo, a great horror and a darkness fell upon him. And while Abraham is asleep here, he's given a dream where God speaks to him and gives him a prophecy about what would happen to his descendants in Egypt and how God would bring them back again into the promised land. But the point I want to notice here is Abraham had made this sacrifice. He had set it up to make the covenant. And when the birds were coming, he was driving them away. Abraham was waiting for God to turn up so they could walk through this covenant together. But God wasn't turning up. God was waiting for something else. God was waiting for Abraham to fall asleep so that God would walk through this by himself. Remember the covenant promise, that the gospel promise that God gave to Abraham in chapter 12? It was a promise about what God will do. He says, I will bless you. I will lead you into the land. I will bless those who bless you. And in thee shall all nations of the earth be blessed. It was a promise about what God will do. And now he's confirming that promise with this covenant. He's not about to bring Abraham into it and say, it's about what I will do and about what you will do as well. And we've got to put our works together to achieve this goal. No, God's making the point that this covenant promise is about what God will do. And so in verse 17, we read, and it came to pass that when the sun went down and it was dark, behold, a smoking furnace and a burning lamp that passed between those pieces. And the same day the Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying, unto thy seed have I given this land, from the river of Egypt unto the great river, the river Euphrates. So God walked through that himself. We had this idea of this pillar of fire walking through this sacrifice. Okay, God is walking through that alone, making the covenant, because he's trying to make the point that it is what he will do. He has promised to do this and he will fulfill it. He doesn't need Abraham to join his works to what God is doing. No, he just needs Abraham to trust in God's promise of what he will do. And so we see here that God called Abraham with the promise. And throughout these stories, we see that God is continuing to lead Abraham through the promise, continuing to call Abraham to look to the promise and to follow after it. But unfortunately, in the next chapter, Abraham's faith fails. We read in Genesis 16, beginning in verse 1. Now Sarai, Abram's wife, bare him no children, and she had a handmaid, an Egyptian, whose name was Hagar. And Sarai said unto Abram, behold now, the Lord hath restrained me from bearing. I pray thee, go in unto my maid. It may be that I may obtain children by her. And Abram hearkened to the voice of Sarah. And Sarai, Abram's wife, took Hagar, her maid, the Egyptian. after Abram had dwelt 10 years in the land of Canaan, and gave her to her husband Abram to be his wife. So here we see that they actually stopped trusting in the promise of God. Or rather, they stopped trusting that God could fulfill his own promise. You know, they still believe that, okay, Abraham's going to be able to have children by this new wife that we give him, okay? And that's how God's going to fulfill his promise. They've waited for God to give them children. It hasn't happened yet. And so they think maybe we need to help God fulfill his promise. Maybe we need to sort something out with our own works. And if we do this and we provide a child, then God can fulfill the promise through him. But that's not how God works. That's not how God's promise works. And so we saw before, when Abraham was faithful, God responded by giving him the promise. Each time, God continued to lead him by giving him the promise each time he was faithful. But now that they have been faithless, how is God going to respond? We see this in the next chapter, in chapter 17. We see how does God respond when his people are faithless. In Genesis 17, beginning in verse 1. And when Abram was 90 years old and 9, the Lord appeared to Abram and said unto him, I am the Almighty God. Walk before me and be thou perfect, and I will make my covenant between me and thee and will multiply thee exceedingly. God comes to Abraham and he again repeats his promise. He calls Abraham to continue to follow him and he will multiply him exceedingly. He puts his promise before him. And not only does he put his promise before him, but as we were going to carry on reading this, he puts his promise in the most fullest and detailed form that we've seen yet. He carries on in verse 3. And Abram fell on his face, and God talked with him, saying, As for me, behold, my covenant is with thee, and thou shalt be a father of many nations. Neither shall thy name any more be called Abram, but thy name shall be Abraham. For a father of many nations have I made thee, and I will make thee exceedingly fruitful, and I will make nations of thee, and kings shall come out of thee. So God gives him the promise, and then he changes Abraham's name. A name that means he's going to be the father of many nations. And then in verse 7, and I will establish my covenant between me and thee, and thy seed after thee in their generations, for an everlasting covenant, to be a God unto thee, and to thy seed after thee. And I will give thee unto thee, and to thy seed after thee, the land wherein thou art a stranger, all the land of Canaan, for an everlasting possession, and I will be their God. So he not only gives him the promise, then he changes his name to Abraham, meaning father of the nations. Then he again is going to establish this with another covenant. He gives them, following on from this, the covenant of circumcision as a physical sign of the promise that he will make. And he not only does that, he then changes Sarah's name in verse 15. And God said unto Abraham, As for Sarai thy wife, thou shalt not call her name Sarai, but Sarah shall be her name. And I will bless her, and give thee a son also of her. Yea, I will bless her, and she shall be the mother of nations. Kings of people shall be of her. And then leading on from this, he carries on in this promise, giving more detail. And God said, Sarah thy wife shall bear thee a son indeed, and thou shalt call his name Isaac, for I will establish my covenant with him for an everlasting covenant, and with his seed after him. So he's given him the promise. He's changed Abraham's name. He's made a new covenant of circumcision as a physical sign of this promise. He's changed Sarai's name to the mother of nations. He's told them the name of their son that they will bear, and that he will be the one that carries on this covenant. And finally, in verse 21, we read, But my covenant will I establish with Isaac, which Sarah shall bear unto thee at this set time in the next year. He gives us the time that the birth will take place. So as we saw, every time Abraham was faithful, God gave him the promise to continue to lead him. But this time, when they have been faithless, when they have fallen, God gives them the promise again in its fullest and most detailed form to restore them. God doesn't want them to fix themselves up And then once you've fixed yourself, then I can give you the promise again. No, he is giving them the promise. In their lack of faith, in their weakness, God wants to give them the promise, and it's the promise that is to restore them, the promise that is to continue to lead them. And he doesn't just give them the promise here in verse 17. In the next chapter, he gives it to them again. In Genesis 18, beginning in verse 1, and the Lord appeared unto him in the plains of Mamre, and he sat in the tent door in the heat of the day, and he lifted up his eyes and looked, and lo, 3 men stood by him. And when he saw them, he ran to meet them from the tent door and bowed himself to the ground. Now, as we know, the story carries on. 2 of these people are angels that will go down to Sodom and Gomorrah. And the other one is the Lord. This is Christ himself has came down. So in Genesis 17, God again appeared to Abraham and gave him this promise. Now in Genesis 18, he actually comes to him in a bodily form to sit with him. And listen to what he says in verse 9. And they said unto him, where is Sarah, thy wife? And he said, behold, in a tent. And he said, I will certainly return unto thee according to the time of life. And lo, Sarah, thy wife, shall have a son. And Sarah heard it in the tent door, which was behind him. And when Sarah heard this, she laughed. The idea that she would be able to give birth was just so beyond what she thought was possible. But in verse 13, we carry on. And the Lord said unto Abram, wherefore did Sarah laugh, saying, shall I surely bear a child which am old? Is anything too hard from the Lord? At the appointed time I will return unto thee according to the time of life, and Sarah shall have a son. So here God repeats his promise again. When Abraham was faithful, God gave him his promise to continue to lead him each time. When they were faithless, God gave Abraham his promise twice, in its most full and detailed form. Now, I think this is incredibly significant because so often when we're on a spiritual high, when everything is going right, when we're feeling connected with God, we can read the promise of God and we know they're for us. We can claim them and they strengthen us. But when things aren't going quite so well, when we're feeling distant from God, when maybe we've missed devotional, maybe we're feeling distant, we've done something that we knew we shouldn't have done. Okay, we start feeling distant for God and we read the promises and they just don't seem like they're for us. They just don't seem like we can claim those promises for us. Satan gets us thinking that we need to do all the stuff. We need to fix ourselves. We need to make ourselves come back from God, to make ourselves better. And then once we've fixed ourselves, then we can start claiming the promises of God again. But that is not what we see here. That is not how God led Abraham. God called Abraham out of Babylon with the gospel promise. God led Abraham every step of the way as he was being faithful with the gospel promise. And when Abraham was faithless and fell, God restored them with the gospel promise. It's the promise that has led them every step of the way. And next, we're going to jump to Genesis 22. Not only did he call him with the promise, not only did he lead him by the promise and restored him by the promise, but Abraham also overcame by the promise. In Genesis 22, beginning at verse 1, and it came to pass after these things that God did tempt Abraham and said unto him, Abraham. And he said, behold, here I am. And he said, take now thy son, thine only son Isaac, whom thou lovest, and get thee unto the land of Moriah, and offer him there for a burnt offering upon one of the mountains that I will tell thee of. Abraham here was being tested of God. He was being tested on the same point that he failed at last time. Last time when he failed, he thought God had a promise that he had given me, but God needs our help to fulfill it. God needs my works to provide a son so that he can fulfill his promise through him. And so Abraham is being tested on that same point here, because God has said to Abraham that in Isaac shall thy seed be called. And now he's calling him to offer up Isaac as a burnt sacrifice, to sacrifice his son. God's calling Abraham to put his works in opposition to his promise. Because if God's promise was that Abraham would be heir, through Isaac, that the promise would come through Isaac to all the world. Okay, and if there was something that was going to stop this promise from happening, the one thing that you'd think could stop this promise from happening is if Isaac died before having children. Then he could no longer be the heir. Okay, and that's exactly what God is asking Abraham to do, to take his works and do the thing that is most opposite the promise. Okay, to put your works in opposition to the promise. And he's putting him, effectively giving him the question, what do you trust more? Do you trust that your works will be able to stop me from fulfilling my promise? Or do you trust that my promise is able to overcome all your works? And Abraham trusted God's promise. He believed that even if he was to sacrifice Isaac, God would still be able to fulfill that promise. God would be able to raise up Isaac again, resurrect him, and fulfill the promise through him. And as we see down in verse 9, and they came to the place which God had told him of. And Abram built an altar there, and laid the wood in order, and bound Isaac his son, and laid him upon the altar, upon the wood. And Abraham stretched forth his hand, and took the knife to slay his son. And the angel of the Lord called unto him out of heaven, and said, Abram, Abram. And he said, here I am. And he said, lay not thy hand upon the lad, neither do thou anything unto him. For now I know that thou fearest God, seeing that thou hast not withheld thy son, thy only son, from me. And so Abraham trusted God, trusted that God was still able to fulfill his promise, regardless of what he did with his works. I've used this illustration before of a candle and a bowl of water. It says, if I gave you a candle and I gave you the promise that no matter what would happen, that candle would not go out, that candle would continue to burn the whole way through. And then I told you to put that candle underwater. Now, you've got a choice. Like, if you put that candle underwater, you might think it's going to extinguish the flame. But I've given you the promise that the flame will continue to burn no matter what. And so the question is, if you put that flame under the water, do you trust my promise? Do you want to keep the flame burning and think that your works have to protect the flame? Or are you going to trust my promise and think no matter what your works can do, my promise will overcome it because I have said it? That is the choice Abraham had here. And as we said before, Abraham trusted that no matter what his works would do, God's promise was stronger than them. And if Abraham was to kill his son, God would be able to resurrect him from the dead. And so Abraham was able to do this, not out of sheer determination and obedience that he was going to kill his son, but clinging only to the promise of God, thinking that in Isaac shall thy seed be called. That was the promise that was on Abraham's mind the whole time, thinking that God is going to bring him back. And carrying forth with this faith, God speaks to him. The angel of the Lord comes down in verse 15. And the angel of the Lord called out to Abraham out of heaven the second time and said, by myself have I sworn, saith the Lord, for because thou hast done this thing, and hast not withheld thy son, thy only son, that in blessings I will bless thee, and in multiplying I will multiply thy seed as the stars of the heaven, and as the sand which is upon the seashore. And thy seed shall possess the gates of his enemies. And in thy seed shall all nations of the earth be blessed, because thou hast obeyed my voice. And so here again, Abraham is overcome by trusting in that promise. And God again delivers to him this gospel promise. Abraham overcome by believing that in Isaac shall thy seed be called. And that led him to believe that God would raise his son back from the dead, that he would not lose his son, but God would still fulfill his promise through Isaac. And we see this as again spoken of in Hebrews 11. If we jump in there, in Hebrews 11, verse 17 to 19. By faith, Abraham, when he was tried, offered up Isaac. And he that had received the promise offered up his only begotten son, of whom it was said, that in Isaac shall thy seed be called, accounting that God was able to raise him up, even from the dead, from whence he also received him, in a figure. And so here in Hebrews, he's actually saying the same thing that we've looked at. That Abraham was able to offer up his son Isaac because he had faith in the promise of God, because he had faith that God had said, "In Isaac shall thy seed be called." And so that Abraham believed that God was able to raise him up from the dead and to give his son back to him if he had to sacrifice him. And so it was only through the promise, through trusting in the promise, that Abraham was able to overcome his former failures, that Abraham was able to overcome his doubts. He didn't overcome by sheer determination of will and by simply saying, "I'm going to follow this, I'm going to obey, I'm going to grit my teeth, and I'm going to force myself to do everything right." No, he only overcame by trusting in the promise. And this is the lesson that God was trying to teach Abraham here. It's the same lesson that is critical for us to learn. God was teaching Abraham to look to and trust in his promises alone, not in our works. It's God's promise that called Abraham to follow him. It's God's promise that led Abraham every step of his journey. It's God's promise that restored Abraham when he fell, and it's God's promises by which Abraham had overcome. That's how it was with Abraham, and it's the same with us. God has his promises for us that we are to live by and that we are to follow. And we're going to jump into Hebrews because it has something to say in Hebrews 8 about the promises that God has for us. In Hebrews 8, verse 6. "But now he hath obtained a more excellent ministry, by how much also he is the mediator of a better covenant, which was established upon better promises. For if the first covenant had been faultless, then should no place have been sought for the second. For finding fault with them, he saith, Behold, the days come, saith the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and the house of Judah." And this is the covenant that we read at the beginning in Jeremiah chapter 31, the covenant that God promised of what he will do. But the 2 points I want to bring out here, when it talks about this new covenant, it says it was established upon better promises, and that the first one was faulty. Now notice it doesn't say that the covenant contains better promises, but it was established upon better promises. That means the better promises were not the content of the covenant, but the foundation for how the covenant was to work. And if we jump back to Exodus 24, when this covenant was made, we're going to see what was the foundational promise of the old covenant and why is the new covenant so much better. Here in Exodus 24, verse 3, "And Moses came and told the people all the words of the Lord and all the judgments, and all the people answered with one voice and said, All the words which the Lord hath said will we do." And then again in verse 7, "And he took the book of the covenant and read it in the audience of the people, and they said, All that the Lord hath said will we do and be obedient." These 2 times when Moses told them they were going to make a covenant, and then when they made the covenant, they said the same thing. What the Lord has says, will we do. And that was the foundational promise in the old covenant. It was the people promising what we will do. Whereas the foundational promise in the new covenant, which we saw that was preached to Abraham and which we saw again in Jeremiah 31, was God saying, "I will." The new covenant promise is God saying, "I will." The old covenant promise is the people saying, "We will." And here we can see why he talks about the new covenant being established upon better promises, because it is the promise of God saying what he will do. It is God's promise leading us, not our works determining to follow God. And these 2 covenants do represent the 2 types of approaches people have towards following God. The question comes down to, does your journey with God, is it based upon your ability to keep your promises, or is it based upon God's ability to keep his promises with us? Which one of these 2 characterize your journey with God? Because we saw how God led Abraham. And the lessons that God was trying to teach is this journey with God, when he calls us, as he leads us, when he restores us, and when we overcome. It's not about our promises to God. It's about our ability to trust God's promises to us. And we're going to see this again. That there's these better promises played out in the life of Christ. The last verses we're going to look at here today. In John 14, verses 1 to 3, this is one of my favorite promises in all of Scripture. Christ is speaking to them, and he says, "Let not your heart be troubled. You believe in God, believe also in me. In my Father's house are many mansions. If it were not so, I would have told you. I go to prepare a place for you. And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and receive you unto myself, that where I am, there ye may be also." This is an amazing promise that Christ gives. But a while ago when I was reading this, there was something that someone pointed out to me that seemed like a little bit of a contradiction or just something odd. He starts off by saying, there are many mansions in my Father's house. Okay, there's lots of places, there's lots of room. And then he says, I have to go to prepare a place for you. And it seems strange, like, why is Jesus needing to prepare more places if there's already lots of places there? And as an illustration that made sense of this, when I went to go to college to study theology there was a problem that I had that I wasn't sure if I'd be able to get in, because I dropped out of high school when I was 16. When I was younger, my mind just had no interest in school or anything. So I didn't get school cert. I didn't get, the earliest like qualifications you get in high school. And so I was a long way off anything to do with university entrance. And so I knew that there were lots of places in the theology class for students. I just didn't know if there was a place for me, because I didn't know if I met the criteria. In fact, I knew I did not meet the criteria needed to enter university. So there were lots of places there, but was there a place for me? Luckily, somehow, I don't know how, I managed to get in. They just overlooked all of that and I got in. And that's a similar thing what Jesus is saying here. There are many mansions in heaven. There is lots of room in heaven. But do we meet the criteria needed to enter heaven? We don't. And that's why Jesus is saying he's going to prepare a place for us. Okay, he's preparing a place specifically for us so we can get in there. There's lots of room in heaven, and he's making sure there is a place specifically for us. Now, what really gives this promise the real gravity is when we understand who Jesus was speaking to. Because often when we read the Bible, we just start at the beginning of the chapter and we read through. But we have to keep in mind that the chapter and verse divisions were put in there for our convenience when we are trying to find things in the scriptures, but they're not in the originals. So often you've got to go back to the previous chapter and read through as though it's one continuous thing. And when we do this, we find something interesting. I want us to notice, who is Jesus speaking to, and who is Jesus specifically giving this promise to? In John 13, verse 37, we read, Peter said unto him, Lord, why cannot I follow thee now? I will lay down my life for thy sake. Jesus answered him, Wilt thou lay down thy life for my sake? Verily, verily, I say unto thee, the cock shall not crow till thou hast denied me thrice. Let not your heart be troubled. You believe in God, believe also in me. And when I realized that this promise was one that Jesus was speaking to Peter just after he told Peter that he would deny him thrice. He said, Peter, you are going to deny me 3 times. And then he gives him this promise. Don't let your heart be troubled. I'm preparing a place for you in heaven. Peter had given Jesus his promise. I will lay down my life for your sake. But Peter's promise was going to fail. Just like the old covenant, when they said, we will do. They could not, and Peter would not keep his promise either. Our promises often fail, but Christ's promise would not fail. And Christ's promise here was not given to Peter when Peter was confessing, you know, you are the Son of the living God, when he was out there healing and in preaching, when he was following and in this spiritual high place, when he was doing everything right. Jesus promised he was given to Peter when he told him he would deny him. When Peter would be at the lowest is when Jesus wanted this promise to be meaningful to him. And here in the life of Christ with this promise, we see the same thing that we learn throughout the life of Abraham. When Peter here was at his lowest, when he had denied Christ, when his promises that he had made to God had failed, Jesus wanted Peter to know that the promise that God was making to him would not fail. When he was at his lowest, he wanted to know, at your lowest, you can still trust the promises of God. It is God's promise that he wanted him to hold on to restore him. It is God's promise that would lead us. And again, I want to leave us with this thought, because so often it is so hard to believe that God's promises are meant for us when we're feeling distant from him. But as we've seen in the life of Abraham and the life of Christ right here, there is no point where we can be. When Abraham was living in Babylon, God's promise was for him and to call him to be his people. When he was, whether he was faithful or whether he fell, God still gave him his promise to lead him and to restore him. His promises would overcome. And here again, when Peter's promises to God fail, Jesus wants him to know that God's promise to him would not fail. When we are at our lowest is when Satan wants us to believe God's promises are not meant for us. But that is the opposite of when they are meant for us. When we are at our lowest, God's promises are the most meaningful. He wants us to hold them the closest. And that is how he wants to lead us.